Hello and welcome to Legal Thinking from RWK Goodman with me, Ed Wootton.
And me, Liam Pep.
How you doing, Liam?
I have many things going on, as in I am full of cold, but that's not getting me down because it's what, a week and a half before Christmas, and I'm full of mulled wine. I mean, not right now. This is a working hour. The mulled wine hasn't started yet, but metaphorically. From the sheer amount of mulled wine I've drank over the last couple of weeks, there must be some of it left in my system.
You're basically just one big clove, is what you're saying.
I'm full of cheer, is what I'm saying, Ed. How are you?
I think I'm about a few days behind you on the cold, so unfortunately I don't like mulled wine, so what am I going to do?
Listeners, we had our Legal Thinking Christmas meal last night, so I got the opportunity to spread this to Ed and our 10-person Legal Thinking production team. But it's not a COVID, it is just a cold, which is fine.
So this week we are talking to Rob Walton from our real estate team about rent reviews. So we've asked them basically a load of frequently asked questions around rent reviews in the commercial sector for both landlords and tenants that might be useful for them to know.
This starts off with a really quick Q&A where we kind of go over everything. And then towards the end, we start looking forward to 2023 and what both landlords and renters can expect from the markets going forward.
Yeah, it's good stuff, and it's very informative and concise, so sit yourself down with a cup of tea and have a listen.
Roll tape. So, do you think rent is likely to go up in 2023?
I think it's a bit of a tricky question to know the answer to, really. If you've got a ongoing rent review that's going to be attached to RPI, for example, then your issue is that, because obviously it's linked to inflation. In terms of the current market, I think the commercial market is going to go through probably a similar downturn as to the residential market. So there's probably an interesting battle for negotiation between landlords and tenants to be had.
So if rents were to go up, I mean, it might seem an obvious kind of question and answer, but why might they be going up right now?
Well, in terms of why they'd be going up, it's if you've already got an existing lease, which is tied into a rent review. In terms of a brand new lease, that's where you're negotiating what your rent review will look like, and also your initial starting rent. That's where your probably initial negotiation is going to be interesting, and that's where you need some advice from a specialist surveyor.
Okay.
And how often can landlords choose to put up rent?
This is going to be dictated by your lease. It will go and say exactly what your rent review dates are. So that's your first port of call.
Okay. So if they've already done it once this year, that doesn't necessarily rule out their ability to do it again?
No, it depends what your lease says. If your lease says you have a yearly rent review, for example, then they can do it once per year. It could be 3 yearly, 5 yearly. They only get one bite of the cherry per rent review date. Okay,
so and there are kind of two questions in one here. Do you need like a new agreement if you're in the middle of a contract term and there's a rent review? And what's the difference between like a lease renewal and then a rent review?
Yeah, so a lease renewal is something that will come at the end of your term. Now, it depends how you hold your lease. If your lease is within protection of the 1954 Act, then you'll probably enter into a lease renewal, if you want a new lease, that is. But if it's outside of that, then your lease could just come to an end and you have to enter into a brand new lease. That's where you negotiate the terms.
And what is a Section 13 notice?
So Section 13 notices are not something we have to worry about for commercial property. They are attached to assured short hold tenancies, so that's residential property only. As I'm a commercial property solicitor, fortunately, I do not have to go and deal with those.
Good stuff. That makes things easier. In terms of when the rent reviews are happening, how much could landlords actually, or can landlords put their rent up by?
Yes, that's going to be dictated by your rent review clause. It's going to set out exactly how rent review is governed. So there's a few ways it can be done. It could be linked to RPI, for example, or it could be an open market rent. They're the two most common. There's also things like turnover rent as well.
Mm-hmm. And could you just expand on the RPI rent element? What is that?
Yeah, so RPI is linked to the retail price index, which basically is almost a measure of inflation, essentially. As we probably can't avoid at the moment, that's exceptionally high. So you're looking really then at rent reviews that could be 10, 15%, depending on what the RPI currently is.
Okay. And could a landlord do something, for example, like just like double the rent straight off, or would that be precluded in any way?
Well, no, it depends exactly what your rent review clause says, is how it's governed in terms of what it can be increased by, because there should be a calculation in there. And also, for example, if it's an open market rent, then there's going to be a surveyor calculating what the property is worth. If it's an RPI, there's going to be a mechanism in that lease to calculate it exactly.
Okay.
Could landlords ever legally receive a rent review notice from their tenant? Is that a situation that could ever arise?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Sorry. In terms of whether a landlord undertakes a rent review, it is up to them. So you don't see tenants can't forcibly, unless their lease allows for it, which is not very common, can't forcibly put a rent review in place. And generally, rent reviews are upwards only, so it's unlikely that a tenant's going to want to enforce it in any case.
And are tenants able to challenge a rent increase?
Yes, they are, usually, depending again what your rent review clause says. So there's usually going to be a clause at the end, which will be maybe an expert determination or an arbitration clause if you believe it hasn't been conducted correctly. Now, if it's open market rent review, then it's possible that you've had a figure from another surveyor which you're not happy with, so you have the ability to go and challenge that and get your own surveyor. It is much more difficult with an RPI because there's simply a calculation. So unless that calculation has been done incorrectly, it's going to be difficult to go and challenge that.
Okay, so we've read something about what's called a rent reduction request. Is that a thing? And how might a landlord reject that if they didn't want to reduce the rent?
Yeah, so that's basically, you got that a lot during the period of COVID, of course, when people were looking to go and reduce their rent to simply allow them to continue to trade, because those things are more prevalent when the market conditions are such that a landlord would struggle to go and get another tenant. At that point, you could probably go and serve a rent reduction request and obviously see what the landlord has to say. Simply go and argue that we won't be able to continue to trade, therefore you're not going to find anyone else to come into the property. In the current days outside of COVID, I think they're unlikely to be accepted unless there's very significant circumstances or you've got a very friendly landlord.
And I mean, you've kind of touched upon that there, but what are the chances of rent being reduced on review?
Generally, there isn't any chance. It depends what your clause says. The clause, you will usually say it is an upwards only if it's been drafted well, unless there's been a negotiation at the start. So there is a possibility, depending on how it is worded. If it's simply worded, this is the calculation, or it's an open market rent review and it's not upwards only, then it is possible. Of course, with an RPI, it will always go up because there's always going to be an element of inflation unless we ever get to negative inflation, which I'm pretty sure that will never happen.
And when it comes to rent reviews and the challenges tenants might, like you mentioned COVID, for example, the challenges for tenants might be able to pay it and all that kind of stuff. Are there any particularly creative solutions to the issue of rent reviews that tenants might find challenging? So, for example, you mentioned turnover rents earlier on.
Yes, again, this is something else that would be in your rent review clause. I mean, they can be linked to turnover, essentially just linked to how well the tenant's company or as even an individual, how well that business is doing. And so obviously you get a percentage of that. So they're more unusual to go and see. You see them occasionally depending on what the nature of the property is. So again, that's the thing where you probably want to go and take specialist advice, or if you're entering into a brand new lease, it is something of a possibility, but if you're trying to link it to turnover, because obviously if you're in early days in terms of your business, and you can link it to how well your business is doing, that's obviously better for you. But then in the current market, I think it's difficult for a landlord to go and to agree to that.
And what should people look out for in a lease renewal?
Yes, this is an interesting point at the moment. If you're taking on a brand new lease or you're entering into a lease renewal, it's your negotiation over your rent review clause. Now, typically, you'd have an open market rent, but that's something that landlords obviously going to move away from at the moment because of the downturn in the market. So they'll certainly want a rent review linked to the RPI. Now, because the RPI is so high, that's very unattractive for tenants. So you're looking for a negotiation, essentially. In terms of the tenant's position, they probably want an open market rent. From the landlord's position, they want an RPI rent. In terms of trying to find some form of negotiation, there could be something called a cap and collar RPI. So what that means is you have a top limit and a bottom limit. So you don't get into the very unhealthy situation where your rent is 10, 15% extra or even more because it's linked to RPI. You have a cap, say, I don't know, 5 to 8%. And then you also have a bottom mark, which it won't go below. So that's where then the landlord has to consider, well, if I've got a long lease and inflation does start going down, well, at least I've got some security of knowing exactly what my income is going to be.
I think that's come to the end of all of our questions. So I guess I'll just say, Rob, thank you very much for your time.
That's no problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Legal Thinking, and thank you to our guests for joining us on today's podcast. If you want to find out more about the topic that was discussed today, make sure to have a look in the show notes where we'll have linked everything up.
And you can find all of the back episodes of Legal Thinking in your podcast provider of choice, and you can also subscribe and follow us on there too. And as always, make sure you leave us a 5-star review on a podcast provider of choice, as that helps other people find us. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening.